lecture will be introduced by Dr. Sahar Al-Ali. We know Dr. Sahar since a few months. We are collaborating in some projects and some grants. And she is postdoc in Ireland. I think she is interested in macrobiota in general. She will talk about macrobiota and evolution and something.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm not quite sure if you can hear my voice. That's fine. So my talk today will be about gut microflora as a key in health and disease. And just to start my talk, I'm not a neurologist training. I'm a pharmacist, and I did my master's and PhD working on the whole microbiome interaction. So this is where I will take my lecture today. So as a brief introduction about what's the gut microbiota. So gut microbiota, the word microbiota itself represents an ensemble of microorganisms that reside in previously established environment, which in this case is the host or the human body. And as we know, the human being, he has clusters of not only bacteria, but in general microorganisms like bacteria and viruses and many others, but mainly or the majority is the bacteria. And they are present in different parts of the human body. For example, they are So we can find these microbiota or microorganisms in different parts, like either on the surface or in the deep layers of the skin, and those we call skin microbiota, or they are present, for example, in the mouth cavity, and they are called the oral microbiota. But what we will focus on today are these gut microbes, or the microorganisms that are present in the gastrointestinal tract. And this name, so formerly they were known as the gut flora, microbiota, and this is the name given today to these microbial populations that live in our intestine. So if you look at the gastrointestinal tract, and the colors here depict the number of the microbes that colonize the intestine. So the lowest number is up high in the stomach because of the very high acidity, so they cannot survive more. But once we go lower in the small intestine, it ranges between 10 to the 10 to the 8 bacterial cells per gram. And until we reach the colon, it has the highest number of these colonizing microbes that reach up to 10 to the 12. And therefore, the human beings, actually, they have been recently reviewed as meta-organisms because this results of a close symbiotic relationship or an interplay with their intestinal microbiota. And this assumption involves this more holistic view of the homeostatic relationship or the interplay, where the dynamics of interaction between the environment surrounding the host and the intestinal microbiota of the host itself, like with the immune system and metabolism, must be taken into consideration whenever we talk about either health or disease. So, if we look at how this interplay between the host and microbe can work together or unite to confront any challenge. So the gut microbiota so far is known now to reach a biomass of about 2 kilograms of the whole intestinal body weight. And it comprises an enormous amount of genes. It's about 150 times more than human genome that we have. This means that this whole microbe interplay has a crucial impact on the complex body systems, either immune, metabolic, endocrine, or also neurological systems. And recently, the microbiota itself has been proposed to be a metabolically active organ within our body, but also an endocrine organ within the human body. And from that, we can also conclude that the microbial imbalance, which we call dysbiosis, has been correlated with several health disorders, including now like inflammatory bowel disorders, obesity, metabolic syndromes, but also depression and mood-related behavior disorders. So, my interest about this host-microbe interrelationship or interplay started when I did my PhD in the Netherlands, I defended it in 2012, and that was mainly to understand the dynamic establishment of the host microbial homeostasis in the gastrointestinal tract. The significance of this study was in order to know, because despite the enormous amount of excellent scientific reports that has been found so far and deal with the host microbe interaction, we still lack a detailed understanding of the developmental processes that occur within the initial stages of this microbial colonization or interrelationship between the host and its microbe, which may impact strongly on the resilience of the host microbe homeostasis in later stages of the host life. But also deciphering of these dynamics between the host and microbe of the establishment of such interrelationship can provide a knowledge base for the microbial impact on the host metabolic, immune, neurological systems, which are all co-interacting to determine and sustain a homeostatic host-microbe interrelationship in the intestinal tract. And with the expanding repertoire also of the human diseases, particularly like obesity and inflammatory bowel syndromes that are rising enormously, especially in the developed countries, those are associated with the changes in intestinal microbiota, so deciphering of the molecular signatures that govern this host microbe interplay and also determining what's cause and what's consequence in this relationship, especially in these biosis situations, will be crucial in order to understand the molecular basis of this homeostasis. So the objective of that study was to point out how a short time frame and initial host microbe interactions can mechanistically be critical to understand the subsequent and sequential response cascades. But also we wanted to provide an overview of how the progressive colonization impacts on the host physiology, how this is tightly controlled by highly interlinked regulatory networks, and achieves an efficient and homeostatic interplay between the host and its new residents or the microbiota. So to achieve these goals, this was the experimental setup that we did. So we used germ-free mice as a host, as an animal model for the host, and these germ-free mice, they are sterile mice, so mice that are born completely sterile to sort of mimic the infants in the very early stages of life. And our mice were all adults, 8 to 10 weeks old, and maintained on a semi-synthetic chow diet, which is the normal diet of these rodents. And then these mice were inoculated with a bacterial suspension that was collected from the microbial community, fecal microbial community of their conventional counterparts. Then we collected samples at different time points in order to study the dynamics. So the 0 time point was the germ-free mice that we used, and then after colonization, 24 hours up till 30 days. And we collected samples along the intestinal tract, but also we collected fluids like the plasma, urine, in order to study the metabolites. And with these samples, we did a global transcriptome analysis in order to see how the host can respond to the colonizing microbes. We did also metabolic analysis to see what is the consequence on the metabolites both locally and systemically. We looked at immunohistochemistry as well, but also we profiled the colonizing microbiota to see what is going on in parallel to the host response. So what we first observed from the study was that there was different intestinal regions harbor different microbial communities. So in the jejunum, the microbial community was completely different than those that colonized the ileum, which is lower in the small intestine, and that was completely different from the colon. But also we noticed differences in the diversity of these colonizing microbiota. So the first 2 days had a very low diversity of colonization, and then started to increase after 4 days to reach maximum after 8 and 16 days. And this gives an indication that they are about to convert into like stable microbial community as we see in the adulthood. And then when we deciphered more into which microbes colonize during this stage in the germ-free mice, so there was a major shift from gram-negative bacteria, which we call Bacteroidetes, to gram-positive fermicutes at later time points. And what's quite interesting about these fermicutes, they are the main fermenters in the colon. They ferment all the non-digestible polysaccharides that we eat and convert it into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate and propionate, which is very important for the energy of the colon, for example. And then the next question we asked was, how would the host respond to this change in the microbial community? So we used our transcriptome analysis, and we did what we call a time series comparative analysis, and this identifies significant temporal expression profiles and which genes are associated with these profiles and how they behave. So which these genes, to which gene ontology they belong. And interestingly, the stem fitted the small intestine completely different, as we see in the figures here, from the colon. And they were fitted in different model of expression profiles and reflecting regional transcription or transcriptome differences. So for example, we see in the colon there are clusters of genes that had a high peak of expression after 4 days of colonization. The same set of genes behaved completely differently in the small intestine, and so on. And more interestingly was that nearly 40% of these genes that were regulated in response to colonization of the microbes were annotated with immune-related gene ontology terms in a time and region-dependent manner. And then on the host physiology, we looked into the changes as a response to this microbial community. So the most striking change was in the size of the cecum. So we found that there was an 8 times decrease in the size of the cecum after 4 days of colonization and remained stable afterwards. And this actually indicated that there is a colonization of microbiota that could ferment the undigestible polysaccharides. Not only this, but we also saw an epithelial hyperproliferation, and this epithelial layer is lining the whole gastrointestinal tract. And there was also wider lamina propria where all the immune cells reside. They had more cellularity, and this is again indication of the development and infiltration of the immune system. There was also changes on the morphology of the intestine, like in the crypt, that's where all the stem cells propagate in order to form new intestinal cells. There was an increase in their depth by microbial colonization. And then looking into the defense mechanism of the host, so we saw a striking increase and maturation of pannate cells, and these pannate cells, they are special cells in the epithelium, particularly in the ileum, and they are devoted for their secretion of antimicrobial peptides. So there was maturation of pannate cells, and there was an excessive loading with secretory granules, as we see here depicted by the dark orange granules, and those have antimicrobial proteins inside. And there was an immense induction of antimicrobial peptides, like for example reg-free beta, reg-free gamma, as we see from the other histochemistry over there in the dark brown dots, that were very characteristic at this transient state of colonization that we saw after 4 days. And then we looked more into details. What are the specific microbes that characterize this transient state of colonization? And to our surprise, we found domination of pathobionts. What are these pathobionts? They are commensal microbes, so they are beneficial microbes, but if there is any imbalance, or what we call dysbiosis, in the microbial community, they would transfer to pathogenic bacteria. So we found those pathobionts dominating at day 4 of colonization, as we see here, all those depicted in red, without going into more details, but just as example, the Helicobacter hepaticus was one of those dominant bacteria at this stage of colonization. And in correlation with this, so in parallel to the same time point, we have also seen only transient increase of pro-inflammatory cytokines in parallel to the domination of these pathobionts, like for example interferon gamma, IP10, but also in the metabolites and amines, like for example the ratio between kynurenine to tryptophan. There was massive increase in this ratio at this specific time point. There was also alterations in the chemistry and the number of the goblet cells, which are the mucus-secreting cells, especially in the colon. And this mucus is a very important protective layer, which prevents the bacteria from translocating into the epithelium, so that the immune system cannot recognize it as foreign bacteria. So there was alterations, also transient alterations in the chemistry of the goblet cells. As we see here, the light blue color indicates more what we call sialylated mucins, compared to the normal status after 30 days, which is sulfated mucins. And the sulfated mucins are known to be more protective from the bacterial translocation. And this we already confirmed also when we did a fluorescent in situ hybridization, where we saw translocation of the bacteria, where you see here the green color, inside the epithelial cells, again only transiently, and then we couldn't see it later on at later time points. However, despite of this dysregulation, we still saw that from the hematoxylin and eosin staining, the intestinal histology is normal and the mice also remained healthy. So what could this mean? We concluded from this, but also first we did another correlation between the identified pathogens or the microbiota and the genes that are or that show their peak of induction at 4 days of colonization. And again, this confirmed an association between the expansion of these pathogens like the Helicobacter pylori and Helicobacter hepaticus and type 1 helper 1 type immune response. As you see here, it's quite hard to read from this regulatory gene map, but at least those that are depicted by the red arrows, they are all genes that have their human orthologs also identified in patients with inflammatory bowel disorders, for example. And this was very interesting because this means that these genes could be used as signatures when there is any dysbiosis in terms of the human response. And this again correlated with, so I just picked up some genes here to show you the transient increase in their expression during this colonization, and then it returned to the basal level after 30 days. So the conclusion from this part was that there was an overrepresentation of the pathobionts and the corresponding initiation of inflammatory light cascades, plus the temporal induction of the identified plasma amyloids that are also pro-inflammatory. They actually illustrate that what we meant as skirmish stage during colonization marks a stage where resilience of healthy mice to inflammatory stimuli is most strongly challenged. However, the mice remain healthy, so this would mean that this transient state might be present in general in mammalian species in order to play a key role in the postnatal maturation of the host intestinal barrier and immune system during the process of microbial colonization, mainly to cause induction or development of immune but also metabolic systems, as we see here. So indeed, after the following time points, from day 8 up to day 30, we could see that the anti-inflammatory arm of the immune system started to develop. And this corresponded also to the expansion and maturation of the cholestridial cluster groups of the microbiota, which are the short-chain fatty acid producers or the main fermenters. And as we see here, so there was a major shift of the even short-chain fatty acids that were produced. So in the first 2 days, they were more like succinate and lactate. This means that the initial microbes could not actually extract enough energy from the diet, but later on, this was converted to be propionate, acetate, and butyrate, which are of major importance to the host. Not only on the immune level that we saw these differences, but also we did a complete metabolic profiling to see what are the changes in the metabolites, either in the tissue, plasma, and urine, in comparison to the colonizing microbiota. And to our surprise, only the digestion, which is the very upper part of the small intestine, we could detect changes from day 1, and this we couldn't see in other parts of the intestine. And then it was silenced at day 2, and again started to change from day 4 to day 16. And when we did a co-mapping of these changes in the expression of the metabolic genes and the changes in the metabolites that were determined in the tissue, our main conclusion was that these microbiota cause the metabolic shift from the use of oxidative energy supply, which was characteristic of the germ-free mice and the initial stage of colonization, more towards the use of glucose and anabolic metabolism. So this meant for us that these microbiota have a role in the glucose homeostasis. And indeed, so the modulation of the metabolic shift towards more glycolysis, especially in the jejunum, indicates that there is a prominent role of the gut microbiota in glucose homeostasis and metabolism. This is of particular interest because, for example, I think you are aware of what's the bariatric or the bypass surgery, and this surgery has shown to be very efficient in type 2 diabetic patients in respect to the weight loss. So this would mean from what we saw here as well that a correction of the dysbiotic microbial state that might be present in the small intestine of diabetic patients could be one of the mechanisms underlying the advantages of this bariatric surgery. And finally, the explosion of the jejunum and its microbes from the interaction with the nutrient flow or targeting the microbiota of the proximal small intestine of diabetic patients, for example with interventions like probiotics, could be attractive therapy avenue in order to achieve glucose homeostasis and improve for the insulin sensitivity. And this is like a summary slide characterizing the different phases of colonizing the microbiota in like a germ-free like model. So we have it as early colonizers and later colonizers. And on the host side, there was an early colonizers, or early colonization phase, but also there is a transient response phase and then a later phase. And it was very interesting to see also that even these metabolites we could detect in the urine from very early stages, where we saw that Krebs metabolites, for example, like fumarate, malate, and oxalate started to increase at later time points as a metabolic or microbial metabolites like the trimethyloxide, N-oxide, they increased, and this is quite interesting because, for example, TMO and TMAO, they are very characteristic of patients with cardiovascular disorders, again showing an interaction between these microbes and the diseases that we might see. So, to summarize this part, the colonization of gut microbiota of the mouse rapidly establishes full-size but low diversity microbial community that shifts to high diversity, relatively stable community at later time points, and a transient state of inflammation and microbial imbalance, what we call dysbiosis, represents the strongest challenge to the resilience in homeostasis during colonization in germ-free mice. And establishment of homeostasis occurred in a region-dependent manner where it occurred earlier in the colon than in the small intestine, and this actually makes sense because the colon is colonized with much more number of microbes, so it needs to adapt quite earlier than the small intestine. And the establishment of conventionalized immune and metabolic homeostasis is marked by transcriptional signatures as those genes that are marked with the red arrow, and this could actually be used as signatures in both health and disease. And finally, the jejunal unique response to microbiota plays an important role in glucose metabolism. And the concluding remark of the study was that the time-resolved mining of multivariant dataset applied in the study provides a solid catalog of genes, pathways, metabolites, histology, plasma analytes, but also microbiota that details the processes involved in the establishment of novel state of homeostasis. Thus, it complements the previous studies that targeted intestinal colonization, but just using one single time points as a comparison between germ-free and conventionally raised mice. This would take me to the next step, where during the study, also as I showed briefly before, there was a major change in the metabolites, like the ratio between kynurenine to tryptophan. And this might have an implication because tryptophan, for example, is the major source of neurotransmitters like serotonin, which plays an important role in mood and behavior, for example. So during the process of colonization, we've seen disturbances in the key enzyme which transfers the tryptophan to kynurenine, which is the IGO or indolamine oxygenase. And this disruption has been also characteristic to patients with inflammatory bowel syndromes. So this raises the question whether there is actually an altered behavior and gut-brain axis function during the stage of colonization or adaptation to the microbes. This was again confirmed by the transcriptome analysis that we did, which showed significant downregulation of expression of genes that were associated with adrenergic and cholinergic systems. So, to dig more into details about the gut-brain axis, what is known about the gut-brain axis? This term refers to the biochemical signaling that takes place between the gastrointestinal tract and the nervous system. And this often involves intestinal microbiota, which influence the brain through multiple neuronal, immunological, endocrine, but also metabolic pathways, as you will see in here. So this slide will show how these microbes can interact with this gut-brain axis to transfer the signals from the lumen, where they are present or reside, up high to the brain through the gut. So first, for example, the endocrine, or the cholesterol, but also the immune, like the secretion of cytokines and neuron, which is vagus and internal nervous system pathways. These are all implicated in the crosstalk between the GBA and the microbiota. But also the brain itself, which includes the same mechanisms in order to influence the composition of the gut microbiota that reside in the lumen. For example, under conditions of stress. So we have the hypothalamus pituitary axis regulates the cortisol secretion, and cortisol itself can affect immune cells, both locally in the gut but also systemically in the plasma. And cortisol can also alter the gut barrier function and change the gut composition, microbial composition in turn. Conversely, the gut microbiota itself, but also the probiotic agents, can change the levels of the circulating cytokines as part of the immune response to these microbes, and this can have a marked effect on the brain function. Moreover, both the vagus nerve, which is the main link between the gut and the brain, and the modulation of systemic, for example, tryptophan levels, are strongly implicated in relying on the influence of gut microbiota to the brain. And finally, the metabolites produced by the bacteria, as I just showed with the short-chain fatty acids, are neuroactive bacterial metabolites of dietary fibers that can also modulate brain and behavior. So, this slide will show the strategies that are used to investigate the role of the microbiota or microbiome gut-brain axis in health and disease. So, for example, the information about communication between gut microbes and the GBA is delineated through different means, as we see here. One of those means, as I used in my previous experiment, are the germ-free mice, or germ-free rodents in general, but the mice are the most familiar or popular species that we use, and those can be used to assess how loss of microbiota during development can affect the CNS. Other methods can be the administration of different potential probiotic strains in other animals or even in humans, and those can be used in order to assess the effect of these microbial-like tourists on the host. Also, infectious studies have been used in order to assess the effects of pathogenic bacteria on brain and behavior, and those are mediated largely but not exclusively on the changes on the immune system. And finally, the administration of antibiotics, which can, of course, perturb the composition of the microbiota in temporary controlled and clinically realistic manner. Thus, it's a very powerful tool also to assess the role of gut microbiome behavior and CNS. So far, the data that we have using the probiotics to understand how can they change behavior and mood. So we have two examples here, like increasing concentrations of probiotics like bifidobacterium and lactobacillus in the gut improves mood and reduces anxiety symptoms in patients, for example, with chronic fatigue syndrome and inflammatory bowel syndrome. Also, bifidobacteria have been reported to be particularly vulnerable to the effect of emotional stress in humans, and this is like a reverse example how the system can change the microbial composition. And from our lab, we have seen that chronic bifidobacterial treatment, for example, beneficially affects the neuronal systems and behaviors relevant to depression rats exposed to maternal separation stress early in life. Also, we've seen that in a model of chronic colitis, bifidobacterial lung gut-brain communication involves vagal pathways. When we did a vagotomy, we could see that this all depends on the vagal pathway, but also the B-lung modifies the functional status of the enteric neurons in the gut. We have also data from Lactobacillus rhamnosus, JB1, and its administration had an effect on stress-induced level of cortisol, and the stress-induced levels are significantly lower when the mice were treated with the rhamnosus compared to the control groups. And so far, I took it from there, and what I am focusing on during my research in UCC is how this crosstalk started between the microbiota, so that reside in the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract, with the gut through a particular epithelial cell line. It's called the enteroendocrine cells. They are very, very small population, like 1%, but they are known to secrete different neurotransmitters, like, for example, CCK, GLP-1, PYY, and also serotonin. And then we are trying to understand how the signals are taken from these enteroendocrine cells, mainly to the vagus nerve and applied to the brain. But just to give you an impression on how these microbes can have a role in both health and disease. So under healthy conditions, the predominance of microbiota an intact of intestinal barrier or gut barrier, plus a healthy innate immunity inside the intestinal tract, they all support this symbiotic relationship between the central nervous system function and the gut microbes. However, under pathological stress and or disease conditions, there is intestinal dysbiosis or changes in the composition or the balance of the microbiota, and this can adversely influence the gut physiology, leading to inappropriate brain-gut axis signaling and associated consequences for functions of the nervous system, central nervous system, and consequently disease. So, for example, stress at the level of the central nervous system can also impact on the gut function itself. For example, it may lead to perturbations of the microbiota as a consequence, and the change in the balance of symbionts and pathobionts, favoring pathobionts overgrowth, as I just mentioned, those are the pathogenic or the non-good microbes, result in dysbiosis or imbalance of the system, which can induce inflammation and also loss of the gut barrier function. And this will promote increased translocation of the microbiota or pathogenic bacterial components from the intestinal mucosa into systemic circulation, thus results in systemic inflammation and abnormal gut functions. Of course, these mechanisms would potentially lead to impaired central nervous system function, such as altered neurochemistry, cognition behavior, stress response, and visceral pain. But then an important question to ask is how this interaction starts in a very early life. So if you look at this figure here, it shows several windows of opportunities that we could use in order to modulate the microbiome of the infants prenatally but also postnatally. So we have evidence now that suggests that the microbiota of the infant starts even before birth. So the infant is not sterile anymore as we thought before, but it may be influenced by the maternal immune system and nutrition. And prenatal and postnatal development undergoes vigorous neurodevelopmental phases, and this is possible that it may be indirectly influenced by the fetal microbial population, which comes all from the mother. And this opens, of course, avenues for the development of novel dietary and micromodulating therapies, which may directly or indirectly change the composition of the microbiota and neurodevelopment of the infant. So, if we look more into details about these windows of development that we can use, so this figure shows the temporal profile of the neurodevelopmental sequences in relation to the age of onset of mental disorders and degree also of microbial stability, starting from prenatal up to adulthood and old age, and how this affects the diversity throughout life. So the microbiota dynamically changes throughout lifespan. It's very unstable in the first 1 or 2 years, but then after 2 years, it turns to a stable microbial community, which does not actually change that much or dramatically throughout adulthood. But then in aged people, it starts to change again. So if we look at the microbiota that dynamically changes throughout life, establish its symbiotic rapport or interrelationship with the host with critical windows during infancy, adolescence, and aging. And during these windows, the organism is very vulnerable to external stressors coming from, for example, the environment, which may result in mental disorders. And finally, early life perturbations of the developing microbiota, for example, by the excessive use of antibiotics, can impact neurodevelopment and potentially lead to adverse mental health outcomes later on in life. So now if you look at the potential role of intestinal microbes in the, for example, pathogenesis of some neurodegenerative disorders, preliminary data show that analysis of the fecal microbiota composition, and this is a human study, 72 Parkinson's disease patients and 32 control subjects by pyrosequencing analysis of these bacterial genes, showed associations between clinical parameters and changes in relative abundance of certain bacteria which is not or belong to the Prevotalaceae in the feces of Parkinson's disease patients. So this particular strain was reduced by 77% as compared to the control, which is a huge impact actually. And other examples show that there are current evidences suggesting alterations in the bidirectional gut microbe brain axis or interactions have been also implicated as a possible mechanism in the pathophysiology of several brain disorders, including autistic spectrum disorders or the ASD, but also other disorders in mood and chronic pain. Then if we go back to this model, so we can conclude that the concept of parallel and interacting microbial neural critical windows open new avenues for developing novel microbial modulating based therapeutic interventions that we can use in early life in order to combat the neurodevelopmental deficits and brain disorders that might occur in this very early stage of life. And then one of these very interesting avenues that people started focusing on now is the fecal microbial transplantation. This is not it's not a new technique or anything. It has been known, for example, in China since the very early life, and I think even in pharaonic times as well, they used it in the treatment of certain disorders. But then what's interesting is that the principle underlying the FMT is to restore the balanced microbiota through feces of healthy donors that contain the kinds of bacteria and that the patient's gut microbial community is lacking, and we think that it's linked or causing the diseases that the host faces. And although the main use of this FMT is to treat the recurrent Clostridium difficile infection, which is a hospitalized infection therapy, and this is the major field of the FMT application so far, but still it has also been used successfully in order to treat especially inflammatory bowel diseases and syndrome, obesity, and chronic constipation. More interestingly, that even in a number of non-GI related diseases such as Parkinson's, chronic fatigue syndrome, and autism, still the fecal microbial transplantation has shown to be very helpful. And the fact that this broad range includes neurological disorders that FMT can help in resolving lends additional support to the claim that the brain, gut, and microbiota are actually closely interrelated through an axis formed by a multitude of interrelated pathways. And finally, to my conclusions, so the current evidence suggests alterations in bidirectional brain-gut microbiota interactions. These have implicated as a possible mechanism in the pathophysiology of several brain disorders, including but not exclusively autistic spectrum disorders, disorders of mood, chronic pain, but also Parkinson's disease. And in contrast to the extensive what we have is it's really a huge amount of data that we have from preclinical studies, and they all support such a link between microbes and gut-brain axis. But still, we have very limited information available of how these findings may translate to healthy humans or to disease states involving the brain or the gut-brain axis. So what we need urgently is future research to focus on confirming that the rodent findings that show relevant translation to human physiology and to diseases such as inflammatory bowel syndrome, autism, Parkinson's disease, anxiety, depression, and so on. Also, we need carefully designed translational and clinical studies. They are required in order to determine how alterations in these interactions begin and how they are sustained over time. And these studies should include longitudinal characterization of the microbiome or microbiota and their metabolic profiles coming from large cohorts of carefully phenotyped patients. And I mean by carefully here to include their dietary habits, medication use, health status, and comorbid illness, and to compare them to carefully matched individuals without diseases or healthy individuals. Moreover, controlled intervention studies are also needed to test the effect of, for example, prebiotics, probiotics, and antibiotics, but also dietary modifications and possibly fecal microbial transplantation in patients with disorders in which altered gut microbiome to brain signaling has been implicated. And these studies should include analysis of changes in the intestinal microbiome and their metabolites as well to correlate any effects on the GI function and symptoms with specific microbial changes. And this will be very important also to start with infants, because as I just showed, it all starts from the very early life, in the beginning of development, to see the effects on the brain development and interactions between the gut and brain, and if reagents designed to reduce this dysbiosis can change this interrelation between the host and its microbe. And finally, I'd like to finish my talk by acknowledging all the people that have been involved in these studies, and thanks a lot for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sahar. Any questions? As you can see, it is
easy to use antibiotics too much hot water. Is antibiotic cause of regression to the gut?
But I think with antibiotics for sure they are very low dose of dysbiosis in the microbiome, and they are staying all composition of normal microbiome. So the problem with the antibiotic resistance to antibiotic is that increasing the satellite pathogenic. So you are disturbing the balance between these microbes, the good and the bad. So this for sure is an effect only on the immunological system that is systemically up to the brain and behind and out.
Other questions? Camera? Other questions? No question?
Do you have a set of bacteria composition that's associated with disorder and with health that you would
This is what
collect and infuse or
yes.
give to
So
patients?
this is what we are trying to work on, and we call it like artificial immunity. So instead of the fecal microbiome, people are trying to study the microbes and their metabolites, especially information, so that we can put them all together in species and give them species that have so that we don't inhibit more balance again.
Have you tried genetically modified this situation?
But the problem is that the gene also has a lot of
Genetically modified this bacteria for animal and sea.
yeah, for animals, I think they use antibiotics, for example, to increase both